Welcome everyone to day 3 of the Queer Migrations Conference. My name is Leila Mukhida. I'm a lecturer in German here at Cambridge, where I work on German and Austrian visual culture. And I'm one of the festival co-organisers, along with Tiffany Page and Jeff Maguire. So I also have the privilege of chairing today's panel, which considers queer migrations through the lens of arts and culture, specifically through literature, film, and festival curation. To introduce our first speaker, Nicholas de Villiers. So Nicholas is Professor of English and Film at the University of North Florida. He is the author of Opacity and the Closet, Queer Tactics in Foucault, Barthes and Warhol, which appeared with the University of Minnesota Press in 2012. His monograph, Sexography, Sex Work and Documentary, was also published with the University of Minnesota Press in 2017. And he's currently working on a book manuscript titled Cruisy, Sleepy, Melancholy, Spatial and Sexual Disorientation in the Films of Tsai, Ming-liang. Over to you, Nicholas.
So thank you very much, Leila, Tiffany, and Jeff, for your work organizing this conference. And again, the title of my talk is Queer Diaspora in Tsai Ming-liang's French and Malaysian films. Hopefully it will be clear later why I put those in quotation marks. So Malaysian-born, Taiwan-based filmmaker Tsai Ming-liang's films are remarkably queer. I argue that his films are queer not simply because the director is gay, but in the way that they challenge the binary division between heterosexuality and homosexuality as supposedly fixed identity categories. Tsai expands and revises the notion of queerness by engaging with the local specificity and situated knowledge of the diasporic, migrant, tourist, or otherwise displaced characters in his films and their experiences of sexuality in Taiwan, Malaysia, and France. Tsai's films are queer because they don't conceive of nationality and sexuality as essentialized identities or sexual orientations, but rather help us understand queerness in forms of spatial, temporal, and sexual disorientation. The book project from which this paper is drawn, Cruisy, Sleepy, Melancholy, Spatial and Sexual Disorientation in the Films of Tsai Ming-liang, engages approaches to queer diaspora in work by Gayatri Gopinath, our conference's keynote speaker, and Fran Martin. In fact, I saw both speak in Taipei at the Queer Diaspora Conference in 2010, inspiring this project. I also draw on approaches to queer phenomenology, drawing on the work of Sarah Ahmed, in order to understand Tsai's queering of space. Tsai's films help us think spatially about queerness, including the queerness of crossing borders, the border crossing of the director, the characters within the films, and the films themselves. Tsai connects sexual disorientation to spatial disorientation, specifically through his manipulation of cinematic space in What Time Is It There from 2001, I Don't Want to Sleep Alone from 2006, and Visage from 2009. The concept of sexual disorientation was first proposed by Michael Moon in his essay, A Small Boy and Others, Sexual Disorientation in Henry James, Kenneth Anger, and David Lynch. Moon explains how these artists' works help the reader and viewer see how sexuality is not so much oriented by its object, by the perceived gender or age, race, social class, body type, style of dress, and so on, of its object, as it is disoriented by mimesis. Moon is primarily concerned with how mimetic desire in cinema like that of Anger and Lynch disorients and temporarily dislocates sexuality from any home or orienting binary distinction like homo-heterosexual. In her book, Queer Phenomenology, Objects, Orientations, Others, Sarah Ahmed further elaborates the concept of sexual disorientation with regard to the experience of migration and queer relations to home, adding an important spatial dimension. Building on these queer scholars' work, I'll show how Tsai connects sexual disorientation to spatial disorientation, specifically through his manipulation of cinematic space. I'll also foreground the role of orientation, including the connotations of orient, in Tsai's evolving relationship to Taiwan, his current home, Japan as former colonial power, Malaysia, his birthplace, but where he identifies with Bangladeshi migrant laborers in I Don't Want to Sleep Alone, and France, working on commission for French cultural institutions like the Louvre in Visage. While Tsai's film career and the order in which I discuss the films may appear to reaffirm the Eurocentric queer migration narrative that this conference aims to challenge, I will argue that his films also problematize and significantly disorient and reorient such narratives of globalization and trajectories of identification. Tsai's I Don't Want to Sleep Alone from 2006 is in some ways a continuation of the kind of queer love triangle explored in his earlier Taipei-based film Vive l'Amour from 1994. In this case, the triangulation is between a migrant Bangladeshi laborer, Rawang, played by Norman bin Atun, a battered Chinese homeless man he rescues and nurses back to health, Xiao Kang, played by Tsai's male muse, Li Kangsheng, and a domestic servant, Chen Xiangqi. They all share the same building with a restaurant on the ground floor, operated by Qi's older woman boss, who is looking after her comatose son, who's also played by Li Kangsheng, in Kuala Lumpur's Chinatown area. In this queer love triangle, there's a much more clear expression of jealousy by the man who so lovingly cares for Xiao Kang's body, his bruised and frail body. While he threatens to cut his throat near the end of the film, he is unable to carry out further violence to this body, and Li strokes away his tears in a moment pregnant with both possibility and loss. The film marks Tsai's return to his native Malaysia, though he was born in the Chinese community of Kuching, Sarawak, not Kuala Lumpur. And I'm actually hoping Ash is here, since I'd love to hear your input and feedback on this. However, like Ahmed's discussion of feeling oblique and queer through the disorienting effects of migration, Tsai's relationship to his home is quite complicated. Ian Johnston notes that, quote, "The personal roots of this disconnectedness are broader than simply those of Tsai's sexuality. In Taiwan, he is Hua Tiao, an overseas-born Chinese, someone simultaneously of the culture and outside it. So in this return to his country of his birth, his identification with migrant laborers, the most despised and discriminated against portion of the population, is most appropriate," end quote. Tsai uses his ambivalent or oblique relationship to this homeland to critically comment in this film on both environmental and political aspects of contemporary Malaysian culture, as noted by both Johnston and Kaiman Chang. In terms of the environment, in I Don't Want to Sleep Alone, a smoky haze settles on the world of the film, and Johnston notes that, quote, "This haze has a realistic basis in the annual forest fires in Indonesia that cause such havoc in air quality in Malaysia. But in a radio broadcast, we hear the blame for this shifted onto migrant workers and the supposed illegal fires that they light in Kuala Lumpur," unquote. Along with moments of nudity, this radio broadcast was censored in the cut of I Don't Want to Sleep Alone that was finally approved for viewing in Malaysia due to its perceived political volatility and negative depiction of Malaysia. Tsai here uses an environmental problem to comment on the political problems of xenophobia and racism. It's therefore important to my discussion of Tsai's sense of dislocation that the film's most tender relationship is between a Bangladeshi laborer and a Chinese homeless man without a passport. Johnston notes how there's no overt sexuality to Rawang's care for Xiao Kang. It's a tender act of love, a selfless giving of himself to another. But Song Hui Lim also refers to their relationship as a queer ethics of care. This is in contrast to the forced care that Chen Xiangqi's character must give to the comatose son in shocking, sexually disorienting scenes akin to Lynch's Blue Velvet. Rawang's lost and found mattress is also polysemic. In Tsai's film, Rawang's roommate, Shiva, complains that he's always bringing strangers here to sleep. It's an ambiguous statement, but one that suggests a kind of queer erotic generosity. It's the place where Rawang nurses Xiao Kang back to health, with a poster stating, "I love you" above it. Seeking respite from the heat and bed bugs, Rawang and Xiao Kang drag the mattress to a construction site where Rawang works. The two potential pairs, Rawang and Xiao Kang and Qi, each use this mattress. The latter two using the mattress is the original cause of Rawang's jealousy after he finds them together on it asleep. However, the audience knows that Qi and Xiao Kang couldn't sexually consummate their relationship because they were choked by the smoke, further postponing consummation after an earlier scene where, following Qi's refusal to have sex outdoors under a bridge by the Klang River, they are not able to get a hotel room because Xiao Kang does not have a passport. But Moon argues that sexual disorientation is not only a matter of triangulation of desire. I would suggest that Vive l'Amour and I Don't Want to Sleep Alone are also not simply about triangulations of desire among persons. Rather, they're studies in the disorienting effects of mimesis, specifically the way in which characters are shown imitating and initiating one another. For example, Rawang helping injured Xiao Kang locate the toilet and urinate by supporting his half-naked body from behind, or teaching Xiao Kang how to tie a sarong around his waist after he gives him a sponge bath and carefully removes his underwear. Mimesis is the primary way in which we register queer eroticism in these films, but in ways that are disorienting rather than confirming of our sense of any home orientation of these characters, hetero or homosexual. But this is not, Moon cautions, in order to try to efface the distinction which on the gay side has been so murderously enforced. This is especially urgent for Tsai's Malaysian film. Tsai uses I Don't Want to Sleep Alone to comment on the role of homophobia within Malaysian politics, specifically through the Chinese title of the film and the prop of the discarded mattress. The political aspect of Tsai's film is not only in the allusions to xenophobia and discrimination that the migrant workers suffer, Johnston points out, but also in the Chinese title of the film, Hei Yan Chuan, which translates to black circles under the eyes, which can mean both shadows under the eyes from lack of sleep and a black eye. And quote, Tsai himself has stated how through both the title and the mattress of the story, he's referencing the case of Anwar Ibrahim, the former deputy prime minister and minister of finance, whose political downfall was orchestrated by Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad in a patently faked court case. One aspect of the court case was an accusation of sodomy, a crime in Malaysia based on a British colonial law, I would add, where a stained mattress was brought as evidence into the courtroom and where Anwar appeared nursing a black eye. Yet Tsai's own take on this is not so politically oriented, end quote. Johnston's suggestion that Tsai's film is less politically orientated might be productively complicated, I argue, by an attention not only to homophobia as a political problem and legacy of colonialism, but also how queerness and sexual disorientation factor into Tsai's intervention in local political problems of xenophobia and racism, as well as that of South-South migration and labor. Tsai's concerns are both general and local. His characters figure in problems that are both romantic and political. By calling attention to his own sense of spatial and temporal disorientation in relation to globalization that's also experienced by his migrant characters, Tsai demonstrates the political and critical value of a queer diasporic lens. Like Wong Kar-wai's Happy Together from 1997, about two gay men from Hong Kong living in Argentina in the time of Hong Kong's colonial handover from Britain to China, Tsai focuses on queer transnational migration and labor, and like Wong, Tsai manages to make a cheap color-changing fiber optic toy into a kind of poetic yet ironic image of romantic fantasy. The final shot of the film shows a dream sequence image of the three main protagonists sleeping on Chi's mattress. This shared mattress is shown floating in the middle of a dark pool in the middle of the vacant construction site. A fiber optic toy rather comically floats by as a bittersweet, nostalgic Mandarin version of the song from Chaplin's Limelight accompanies a fade to black and credits rolling. The way these slumbering bodies share the mattress might imply queerness in the form of bisexuality or polyamory, but it also emblematizes a more diffuse form of eroticism associated with being sleepy and dreamy, which Roland Barthes associates with the collective bodily experience of the dark urban cinema in Leaving the Movie Theater, which he suggests actually defines modern eroticism, precisely this kind of relaxation of postures and inoccupation of bodies that makes them sites of erotic availability to each other and to the spectator. But we can't forget that the characters we see here are also quite simply bodies exhausted from labor, pointing to one of the other comforts of the cinema. Like his fictional pandemic disaster musical, The Hole, which is getting actually a lot of renewed attention during the current pandemic, Tsai also juxtaposes a rather destitute reality of urban labor in Malaysia with the Tamil musicals that entertain the migrant workers, and he uses the romantic fantasy elements of the lyrics of these musicals to comment ironically on the rather less idealized vision of sexuality and desire that his film depicts. The final disorienting shot of the bed floating off on black water in the midst of ambiguous urban demolition and construction signifies, to twist a phrase from another text by Barthes, the drift far from the all-too-pure pair, hetero-homo. Tsai's film and characters thus depict both disturbing experiences of dislocation and productive forms of spatial, temporal, and sexual disorientation that ultimately encourage in his audiences a queer way of inhabiting a fleeting and shifting world. So I'll next compare two French-Taiwanese Tsai films, Visage from 2009, which was commissioned by the Musée du Louvre as its first film in their permanent collection, and his earlier film, What Time Is It There from 2001, in order to explore how intratextual and intertextual auteurist references to Tsai's own films and those of Truffaut function in Tsai's metacinematic films, and the significance of Sino-French co-production. What Time Is It There uses parallel editing between Taiwan and France to reflect on transcultural citation, especially Truffaut's The 400 Blows, and temporality. After Chen Qianqi buys Xiao Kang's dual time zone watch off him in Taipei before her trip to Paris, Xiao Kang and Qianqi are shown in different time zones, experiencing different relationships to France. Xiaokang obsessively watches the 400 blows, drinks French wine, changes clocks all over Taipei to Paris time, hoping to escape the difficulties of his home life, left alone with his mother in her melancholy state after the loss of his father. Chen Xiangqi, as a tourist, ironically experiences the rather alienating, chilly, and brusque reality of Paris, what has been called Paris syndrome, a kind of disappointment or subversion of the tourist gaze as described by John Urry. She spends the night with a woman from Hong Kong who takes pity on her in a cafe after she finds her vomiting in the bathroom from too much coffee. The woman brings her hot water. After their potential sexual contact stops short at a late-night kiss in the woman's bed, Chen Qi initiates the kiss and the woman reciprocates, but then turns her head away. The kiss between the women is posited by Emily Barton as a kind of queer intimacy, but also might be an intimacy of home. The two women share the same language in a place where it is not the primary one. In this way, they share the time and space of their home in a place that is geographically separate from it. In The European Undead, Tsai Ming-liang's Temporal Dysphoria, Fran Martin suggests that What Time Is It There, quote, it indexes a characteristically post-colonial relationship to time that I call temporal dysphoria, a disorientation in relation to time rather than space, a subjective effect of the regime of cultural time lag as experienced by post-colonial subjects, end quote. Yet Martin also suggests that, quote, the film can be seen as problematizing its own westward trajectory, as Paris is also figured precisely as the land of the dead. An association is made between France and the Nouvelle Vague, not with notions of futurity and progress, but on the contrary, with impressions of ghostliness and death, end quote. While Barton's reading aligns with Martin's reading of the temporal dysphoria in Tsai's film, I appreciate Barton's refusal to separate queer temporality from questions of space, specifically an experience of space and the problem of home that reflects queer diaspora. Tsai's Louvre-commissioned Visage stars Li Kangsheng as a directorial stand-in named Kang, making a film set in the Louvre starring Truffaut's French actors in an adaptation of Salome. Visage should be understood as metacinematic in the way that it extends beyond intertextual reference and involves making a film about the commission to make the film, a film of commission that focuses on the preparation of the film, the process itself, including dress rehearsals, delays, and interruptions. The actual process of making Visage took 3 years, including research and location scouting. Here I'm adapting Rachel Sagner-Burma and Laura Heffernan's suggestion of a contemporary genre of novels of commission that focus on the process of writing rather than the finished canonical work, an approach that I connect to Tsai's approach to a film of commission. Tsai's Visage is replete with references not just to Truffaut's films and well-known actors, but to Tsai's own queer cinematic universe, itself in a continual state of revision and redrafting. Like Barth's reorientation towards writing in the preparation of the novel, discussed by Burma and Heffernan, I find Tsai's Visage to be remarkably reorienting from French to Taiwanese cultural references, from heteronormative to queer cultural forms and practices, or forms of sexual disorientation. Tsai's cinematic approach to the architectural space of the museum is to literally descend into its bowels and the water-filled old sewer tunnels beneath, in the same way that his films often linger in derelict buildings and cinema toilets as sites for queer cruising. Lee's character also cruises and makes interrupted sexual contact with a French man in the Tuileries brush. Their encounter is interrupted by a call informing Lee that his mother has died and he must return to Taiwan for the Buddhist funeral ceremony. What's worth noting about the many intratextual references in Visage is not just Tsai's practice of creating loops and folds of meaning or folds of space-time within his oeuvre, but also how Tsai reorients spatial and temporal trajectories of identification between Taiwan, Malaysia, and France, and disorients our assumptions about cultural boundaries and divisions between heterosexuality and homosexuality. Moreover, as Ahmed has argued, it's the proximity of bodies that produces disorienting and queer effects. And I'll be wrapping up very shortly. In the longer version of this paper, I discuss issues of Orientalism, queer camp and reparative reading, and the different meanings of face in Chinese and French. So maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A. So post-colonial temporal, spatial, and sexual disorientation are in fact complexly intertwined in Tsai's transcultural, intertextual, metatextual, and intratextual models of citation. While I agree with Michelle Bloom's argument that intertextuality facilitates boundary crossing, reflecting the fluidity of the contemporary age of globalization, with Visage epitomizing Sino-Frenchness for her, I also think Fran Martin's careful post-colonial attention to such strategic citations is crucial. Where I've diverged from Martin is from her insistence that Tsai's post-colonial temporal dysphoria is not also about spatial disorientation. The notion of being in different time zones affects how we perceive both space and time. Like Ahmed's work in queer phenomenology, such divisions also affect how we perceive, quote, the orient and other others, unquote. How we are oriented toward certain cultural objects, entailing how we are oriented in relation to certain bodies and faces, thus involving both sexual orientation and disorientation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Thanks for that, such a rich paper. Please join me in whichever ways you can in thanking our speakers, be it miming, clapping, or clap hands, emojis. Thank you, Nicholas, Daniel, and Nadia for such a wonderful panel. It was such a pleasure to chair.